There you go. So just as a note there that after the session today, we will send a follow-up email that has the recording link so you can view it again at your leisure. And we also will send out the slide deck. You don't need to like scramble and take, furious notes right now or anything. This is more, I would say, kind of general overview, and we do a little bit of discussion. And then of course, you'll get the slides and the recording to view again as you need. So let's go ahead and jump right in since I know we are just after 12. I like to respect everyone's time. I know it's also the lunch hour. So if you're off camera, like eating lunch or whatever, that's absolutely fine. Please do what you need to do. And we'll make this a tight 90 minutes. So just if you want to, I know some folks have dropped their names and stuff into the chat. I appreciate you doing that. It's good to know like who's here today. But if you want to do our board Mad Lib while I kind of kick off a few intro slides, feel free to do that. If you haven't done Mad Libs in a while, maybe you haven't had a long car ride, the board is to the organization as blank is to blank. I can give you an example. The board is to the organization as the steering wheel is to a car. So steering the direction of the organization. So you can ponder on that if you want, and I'll revisit that momentarily. And then as we get going, my name is Callum Brown. I'm the Senior Director of Programs here at the Nonprofit Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joined by my newest and lovely colleague, Jamera Smith, this morning. Jo is literally getting a fire hose of information. This is day 2 for her. So please be kind. You can reach out to us in the chat. If you have a really specific question, she may not be able to answer it for you. I will try to, attend to questions as we go. But if there's something about like memberships or programs in general, we can certainly follow up with you after the session today as well. So welcome, Jo, and excited to have her on board with us today. And then just a little bit about the Nonprofit Center. The Nonprofit Center connects, strengthens, and advocates for a strong nonprofit community. We do that in so many different ways. For all of you that might not be super familiar, like if you're joining us as a board member, today for your organization, I am happy you're here. All programs and services at the Nonprofit Center are available to our member organizations, both staff and board and volunteers. So if you didn't know that, please go back and share that with your teams. We would love to have, other board members and volunteers take advantage of our membership benefits as well. And if you have questions, again, please let us know and we can address them as we go. And if you're not super comfortable with Zoom, we just have a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, we're going to be utilizing the chat. I will, of course, invite you all to unmute if you have things to like share with the group. Feel free to do that, but I am keeping everyone muted at this time just so that there's not a lot of background noise affecting like the video. And you can chat to everyone, or you can chat privately, like to Jo if you have maybe an anonymous question and she can ask it on your behalf. All right, so just another couple of just FYIs before we get going. Again, so many different programs that we have coming up. This board rules program is offered quarterly. So if you have other board members on your team that want to have like a refresher or maybe a brand new, this is a great session for them to attend. So check them out. And then a bunch of other programs that we have coming up. I will email out a list of them after today. And then just a quick grounding, the Nonprofit Center kind of categorizes our capacity building through what we call our Stronger Nonprofits framework. What that really is are 4 key pillars to a strong nonprofit, which include organizational learning and measurement, really referring to like impact measurement of programs and services, our high performing leadership teams, which is really what we're focused on here today with this program, access to capital, which could be financial, but also political, social capital, people like your people, your humans, that's a capital, and then also external awareness and advocacy. So thinking about how does our organization work in the sector to spread the message of our mission and the work that we do. So of course, as a board member, you're also really touching on each of these pillars in the work that you do with your organization. So to talk quickly about our agenda and goals, of course, we are just going to review kind of why boards and the wider context of nonprofits. For those of you that might be newer and not as familiar, we'll talk about the basic roles, the advanced roles, and then we'll, of course, highlight a little bit of discussion and brainstorm some next steps that you might want to take to your board and your team. So first off, going into that wider context of nonprofit boards, the main reason a charitable organization exists is to serve a charitable purpose, right? So we are an organization that benefits the community. Usually we fall into one of those big bucket categories of education, health, the arts, civic advocacy. There's so many more. I'm sure if you've seen your NTEE codes on your 990 filing, there are a million other small kind of subsector issues that you get into. We do have to make a profit at nonprofit organizations. We invest that profit back into the programs and services that we provide. And then nonprofits do have advocacy restrictions, but that's one of our primary goals at the Nonprofit Center is to educate nonprofits about how you can and should be participating in advocacy and lobbying work for your organization. Some prime examples include the Jacksonville Public Education Fund having passed the half-cent sales tax a few years back in order to invest that more into the schools. So one of their primary, missions is to help build the capacity of schools here in our county. So, what better way for them to kind of spend some of their dollars that they have than to hire a paid lobbyist that was able to help them do this work with our local government. So really, really big win for them. And just a couple of basic stats around the sector. You're going to see numbers as big as 4,000, 8,000, as in the number of nonprofits that are here in our Northeast Florida community. What we're counting through our state of the sector research is actually the number of organizations that filed a 990 within the past year. So just over 1,300. So a lot of nonprofits that you see out there are actually inactive or they haven't made revenue to file a 990 in the past year. But still, we are a huge, huge force in the state. We are the second largest employee of the paid private workforce in our community, fourth largest industry in the state. That's right behind construction and manufacturing. And if you drive on Florida highways, you know that how big that is. And then, of course, some harder stats to take, but about 35% of nonprofits operate in the red. We've been doing this research for about 20 years now, and that number has remained pretty stagnant. So it hasn't really changed that much, even with things like the 2008 recession and the pandemic. That's a pretty normalized stat, I would say. And the bulk of organizations have less than $500,000 in revenue, and more than half of those less than 100,000. So thinking again about the true size, most nonprofits are very, very small. It is very the bigger organizations, more corporatized nonprofits are actually in the rare. And so most organizations, experienced a huge increase in the demand for their services during the pandemic and pre-pandemic. And so you can only imagine where we are at today. And still many of these organizations aren't able to meet the demand. So one of the big myths that we love to bust here at the Nonprofit Center is that there are too many nonprofits. We actually know by national, state, local research that that's just not true. So thank you all for the work that you're doing to serve your nonprofit organizations, because it is very, very much needed. And just a couple of other pieces to highlight from local research that we have done at the nonprofit sector or at the Nonprofit Center is this piece actually comes from our 2022 public perceptions poll. And, we saw that most Northeast Florida residents agree that our community would be a better place if more people gave via volunteerism or donating to nonprofits. So nonprofits do have to be really accountable to the public and our constituent base, because they are looking to us to be, the true entities that are solving social ills in our community. So 8 in 10 people really think we would be better off if our community had more engagement in nonprofits. And that's a good thing to take to people when you're thinking about, man, it's hard for me to ask for a dollar. Let's see, a couple of other things that we saw from our public perceptions poll is that, nonprofits are seen to deliver services more effectively, make our community more desirable, and that they really are a vital part of our economy. So, great news. These are the kinds of things that we want to see from our public perceptions poll. And this is polling that was done by the UNF Polling Center. So, really interesting data that we've gotten back. We did conduct this poll a few years back as well. So in 2011, this is kind of what we were seeing. And thankfully, these numbers have really gone up. So since, in the past 10 years of doing this research, we found that more and more nonprofits have a really high they have a high status in the minds of the public. So how can we be accountable to that by being good stewards of both fundraising dollars, but of course our volunteers, and making sure that we really looked into the impact of our programs and services and understand how we are creating change in our community. And then just kind of looking ahead, a couple of other interesting things around the percentages of people in different generational buckets around donating and volunteerism. We're seeing, a lot of young folks engaged in volunteerism, which is great because we know the more people that when they volunteer, they're more likely to donate to organizations. So keeping that in mind when we're really trying to run, smooth, effective volunteer programs at our organizations is how can we really convert those volunteers into potential donors to our organization and help us become sustainable. So, again, great information for us to kind of know about as board members to use in our advocacy pitches as we go out there and connect with future potential supporters. So just another nod to you all as board members or those that work with board members. Thank you, because we can't do this work without you. Nonprofits are community owned, and board members are the ones that are really filtering down that vision to the nonprofit organization. We are not singularly owned by any one person. Our boards are not getting compensation for the work that they're doing with our organizations. So, it's really up to you all to help filter down that vision of what does the community need, and where are our opportunities, and what threats might we have. So there's other reasons that really go into why we need board members. And of course, those are the legal, ethical, and practical reasons. Legally, we're speaking about, the boards providing those checks and balances, really that democratic structure for the organization, and, deciding the path forward on behalf of our mission work. Ethically, of course, we have to obey, both the public law, but also that of like our bylaws and our articles of incorporation as an organization, and raising red flags ethically, paying attention to things like the finances, and knowing when we need to kind of raise our hand and say, hey, we have concerns and this is how we need to address this issue. And then practical reasons really include some of those basic board roles and responsibilities around supporting and advising the CEO, helping to fundraise and resource allocation for the organization, helping through strategic planning. So these are the more practical reasons. And just as we say that, a good reminder again of the difference between volunteerism and board service. I mean, they're both so incredibly valuable. It's just that one is a little more short term and specific to operational goals, whereas the other is more strategic and involves governance. So when we're talking about governance at the board level, we are hopefully talking about minimizing the amount of focus that we have on operational day-to-day issues among the organization, and really focusing on the strategy side. So, where are we at today? How are we reflecting on how we are doing? And where do we want to see this organization in the next 2 to 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So of course, board members have more legal responsibility for the overall functioning of the organization. And on the volunteer side, we're really looking at little to no legal responsibility. And again, more of that really specific operational focus. So these are the 3 primary legal and fiduciary duties of nonprofit board members. And so when we're talking about obedience, again, staying true to the organization's mission, obeying the public law, bylaws. The duty of care is really referring to just using our best judgment, being active participants during board meetings and in board committees, paying attention, asking those pertinent questions, especially when it comes to financial issues. And the duty of loyalty is around avoiding conflicts of interest. So luckily here in Florida, we do have to sign that conflict of interest policy annually. That is actually not the same across the board as far as the United States, but in Florida, it is an annual requirement. And really maintaining the confidentiality of board discussions and putting aside personal gain on behalf of the organization. So conflicts are always going to happen, just as an FYI, that's always going to, rear its head in some way. So for example, say a board member represents, I don't know, whether it's like real estate, and the organization is looking to purchase property or purchase a building, and you want to use that board member to help you out, right? Well, you could certainly do that, but it would be just highly recommended that you look at some other firms as well, get some multiple opinions and kind of proposals, and then discuss among the board while recusing that conflict, that represented board member of the conflict, while you take a vote. And then you bring that board member back and kind of say, if you choose to go with that board member, that's totally fine. That happens all the time, but it's just about how do you handle that process of dealing with the conflict, and then being really transparent in your board minutes about, how the vote was taking place and how you all came to that decision. So definitely that's totally normal. And then this one we always add in. It is not one of the true, legal and fiduciary duties of boards, but the duty of transparency is just one to add in there to really pay attention to. This is referring to things like easy ways to clue in the public on the inner workings of the organization. So posting your 990 to your website. Super simple. Posting your annual reports, posting all the names of your board of directors on your website. Those can seem like kind of like, oh, obvious, but a lot of times you'd be surprised. You Google, nonprofits, and you pull up their board page and it's blank or says coming or to be updated. This is information that is public anyways. The public can go out there and Google it and find it in other ways, such as your 990 via Candid, GuideStar. But it's just providing that extra level of comfort to supporters when they know they can just Google your website and find all the information right at their fingertips. And then when it comes to kind of our board fiduciary responsibilities, here are, the major things that you really need to be aware of, right? So are funds handled and accounted for in a really transparent way? Do we have appropriate accounting processes as far as like who's handling checks, who gets the mail, who opens them, who signs checks? How is that process actually laid out in your organization? Reviewing our financial position, our statement of activities, otherwise known as our balance sheet and our profit and loss, approving our annual budget, reviewing our IRS Form 990. So these are the basic real duties that every board member should be comfortable in engaging with when it comes to the financial aspects. And, just a reminder that, of course, many of us do not come to the board of directors, with all of the expertise that we would like to have, right, in finance. Like, I'm not a CPA, I'm not, a lawyer. I don't have this knowledge at my fingertips. So what can we do? We can really prioritize learning around this subject. Having a good culture of inquiry at our board table is really important. So being able to actually say, like, how comfortable do you feel raising your hand and saying, like, I don't know that I quite understand this document. Can someone, can we have a deeper discussion about it? Or bringing it to the board chair and the CEO that, like, hey, I feel like our board in general is a little behind on understanding key financial concepts and our financial indicators. Like, could we have part of our board meeting be a review of this information as far as like a training, almost not just looking at our financials as we do every board meeting, but learning a little bit more about what are the indicators that we use to assess the financial well-being of this institution. So how can we, develop processes among the board even that support, people being able to ask questions and raise red flags? Because what we never want to hear, and what is never really appropriate, is to say that the board didn't know when it comes to financial matters. When we have prime examples like organizations like Hands on Jacksonville having closed down due to financial mismanagement, and the board saying, we didn't know, that's really, really terrible news, unfortunately. And it looks bad among this sector. It gives us a bad reputation for nonprofits across the board. So, how can we be really good stewards of this financial information? And another reminder that, nonprofit business models vary. They vary so much from one organization to the next. It's looking at things like what is our revenue mix? Like, are we, do we have really diversified funding, or are we an organization that is very heavily state funded? And how we know that, state and government contracts can really vary from one, political affiliation or who's in charge to the next. What does our capital structure look like? Otherwise known as like, what do we own? What do we owe? What are our equity as far as our assets? What's that picture look like? And then how stable and reliable is that? Like, do we have concerns? Is there a whale in our bucket, is what people will normally say, right? Like, do we see the whale is having reliance on any one specific category of funding that tends to actually put the organization at risk? Because, again, if there's changes in grant cycles or structures, how quickly would that put us in a bind as far as our funding capacity? And then, are there new opportunities for new revenue streams? Have we, not utilized an earned revenue stream before, and now we're looking at ways to bring in earned revenue into our organization? Do we really have the right infrastructure to manage the revenue that we have in place? And do we know the true costs of programming? Programming is one of the hardest ones to really nail down sometimes, because we think about all of the fixed costs, but then there's so many indirect costs that comes with programs as well. So how is our operational side, our management, how are they doing over managing things like program expenses? And what does that mean to the actual revenue we're bringing in with those programs? So these are big bucket considerations to also bring back to the board table when it comes to, do we really have a solid, firm understanding of our business model, and how variable is it as far as risk? Like, are we at a higher level of risk because of our financial makeup at this moment? So I'm going to launch a quick poll, actually, and I just want to see, which of these financial documents are you reviewing at this time? So I'm launching that. You should see that right in front of you. I'm going to give you a minute to answer that, and you can scroll down. It's multiple choice. I don't see any. Okay, there we go. It's like, I see them coming in now. Okay. All right, we got a couple of folks. I'm going to give you guys another minute. All right, looks like we have the majority, I would say. We have the majority at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share that out to everybody. So it looks like, of course, the majority of you are reviewing the annual budget, the budget to actuals. Fewer of you are looking at things like a dashboard, a financial dashboard. So this is helpful just to know. If there was an other, feel free to drop that in the chat as well. But this is really just to think about, how much information are we getting at our board meetings when it comes to the finances? Is it like way too much information? Is it too little? Does it feel like maybe we don't have a full picture when it comes to our financials as an organization? Just to kind of explain the dashboard for anyone that does not currently use one, a financial dashboard is something of more of like a graphical chart that kind of pulls in a picture of each of those important documents, right? Like looking at our balance sheet and our profit and loss and our, like our budget to actuals. So that can be like a really helpful tool. I usually send one out in our follow-up email of an example that the Nonprofit Center uses, because it can be a way where, sure, you send all the individual documents to board members to review prior to a board meeting via like a consent agenda, but then we're always going to pull up that big dashboard in a board meeting and look at the overall, all-encompassing picture. And then what we do is, highlight like anything that is a major variance of like $5,000 above or below. So, as opposed to during the board meeting, going in minutia every single line by line, it's looking at those big highlighted ones that, are big variances and having a discussion about those at the board meeting. So, and just Judy all popped in the chat, other new to board, haven't attended board meeting yet. Okay, so exactly, you might not have that full picture yet. So appreciate your answer there. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the actual roles that we have as board members and what that means as far as our high performing leadership team. And just again, to reiterate, for us at the Nonprofit Center, when we're talking about developing a high performing leadership team, what we're really talking about is that relationship between the board and the CEO. So that, that partnership is just so crucial. And what does that take to make it a really strong, effective partnership? So a great quote from Board Source, we often refer to leading with intent. Two particular board characteristics matter the most. It's understanding of the board's roles and responsibilities and the board's ability to work as a team, a collaborative team towards shared goals. So if you're not too familiar with Board Source, I will just say they are the premier, like #1 resource when it comes to nonprofit sector board best practices. So definitely check that out. But another just great, reference is the Patrick Lencioni's the pyramid, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. So when we look at this, what we know from national board research from Board Source is that boards are more effective when they have a high degree of socialization, because socialization builds trust. And so what do we need trust for? We need it to get us to a place of actual results. So when we're talking about like our board teams, it's from the very beginning, just assessing like, how are we doing as this collaborative group? Do we have trust, or are we working in silos? Do we feel like there's some mistrust among the board? Are there board members that have been around for many, many years? Are there kind of like the good old boys or the good old girls, or however it is? How is that picture really looking like for us to build a trusting team? Because we know if we want to get to this like collaborative team towards shared goals, we have to first start with a basis of we actually trust one another. Usually more trust is built through having a more diverse group, because we're hearing a lot of different perspectives at the table. And when we have a lot of different perspectives, we can actually engage in more productive conflict. And the way we're able to engage in productive conflict, as opposed to just like toxic negative conflict, is by having a group that has had time to build trust, cultivate relationships with one another. And when we have a disagreement, it's not so much shooting another person down as far as like your ideas are silly or don't matter, they're not valuable, but saying like, okay, we have this disagreement because we both have so much passion and expertise, and now we're going to disagree in a way that we're going to come to a conclusion together. So through that kind of productive conflict, we can actually get to a place where we can commit to decisions and hold one another accountable. And holding each other accountable is just, it's so important, because when the group says we're going to commit to taking action towards a specific project or goal, like we know we're all in it together, right? Because if we feel like the group is committed, but then we still have that silo of 2 to 3 folks that's, sitting back with their arms crossed, and it's like, well, that's what they said, I'm not into that. You can see how it starts to produce a pretty negative culture among the board. So I think it's a really helpful tool. It's like, how are we doing at the basis level of trust? And a great way to kind of find this out, if you're sitting there saying like, gosh, I have no idea what the full board is feeling like looking at a pyramid like this, what would they say? Well, maybe it's time to do an evaluation of the board. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about board evaluations later. So we'll jump there. But thinking again about, also how does our board look as far as how are we handling this division of operation and governance, can be a pretty important thing to address as well. Because if we're talking about a board of a nonprofit that is still very small and grassroots, chances are you're still pretty highly focused on the current success or the operations of the organization. And you probably do not have as much dedicated time and attention, just honestly, on the governance. So looking at the future success of our organization. And that's totally normal. Just like a nonprofit or any, company or any real like family, like the nonprofit board life cycle, it does change and it scales. So when we start out as really grassroots organizations, we tend to have a very strong focus on the leader. So whoever founded that organization, usually a lot of the public eye is on that one singular person. And we are thinking more so about, gosh, we don't even have paid staff at this point. So it's up to the board to, address the operational day-to-day programs and services that we are providing. So as we start to grow as a board and as an organization, we start to shift more towards looking at governance specifically, maybe developing out a more active committee structure, and then accepting more responsibility for resource generation allocation. So maybe you're thinking right now, like, what stage is our organization really at, or our board? Do we have paid staff? Do we not? When we're looking at kind of a traditional staff and board structure, this is generally what it looks like, right? So the board is at the top because the board has the power to hire and fire the CEO, and staff should report to the CEO and up that chain. But then you might have volunteers that actually report directly to the board. So say, you have your true board, your board members and board committees. Maybe you have a special committee that is not like a standing ongoing one, but it's one you've developed for perhaps a strategic plan, or maybe it's a programs committee or some other, kind of maybe not truly defined as far as a long-term ongoing committee like your traditional three: fund development, governance, and finance. But maybe you have some other committees where you have volunteers from the community that report directly to the board in support of that special committee or task force. So, just keeping in mind, though, that generally once we have paid staff, that we should keep things pretty separate as far as what the board is overseeing as far as governance work, and allowing staff members to have their own autonomy and control over the operational side of the organization, and they are reporting to the CEO about their work and their goals. So 3 reasons surface again and again: a review of unhealthy board CEO relationships, the lack of trust, the ineffective division of labor, and poor communication. So again, talking about that leadership team, when we see challenges in that relationship between CEO and board, it's really around those issues of like, just how are we communicating with one another and how are we building that trusting relationship? So this is vital. And it goes back to, again, how are we handling governance and operations? So when we're looking at things like our fundraising programs, planning, finance, its governance is really the ones that are in charge of creating a strategy that is informed by and supported by staff people or operational volunteers, if you don't currently have staff, that are actually implementing this work, right? So fundraising, you're the ones that are developing that larger goal, like, what is it we're really trying to get this year as far as maybe our number of donors, our types of donors, the money we actually need to bring in, and then, having the operational side actually developing the plan for how to make that happen. So how are we segregating out these duties? And a big one is obviously having the board committees, because where the board is working is in committees. The board works through the committee. The board at board meetings is generally discussing the larger issues that are rising out of work that the committees have already done, right? So what does the committee structure of our organization look like? Do we have way too many? Do we have not enough? Do we have all of our board members engaged in some form or capacity in the actual board work, which is through committees? So another note, we don't have any staff. Okay, but that doesn't let us off the hook for the governance work. So how do we really clearly define and segregate these duties? It's usually through a really strong board agenda, right? So if we have to talk about the operational side, we have a very specific dedicated amount of time to talking about that operational side. And we always still talk about the governance at every single board meeting. At every single board meeting, we need to be thinking around things like, do we need a new strategic plan? Have we evaluated the CEO recently? Is it time for us to do a board evaluation? Do we need to do board recruitment? Those are all primary duties that would come through governance work. So, how can we define our agendas to allow for both if we know we just don't have paid staff? So the board does have to kind of do it all. So I'm going to stop quickly just to see from who's on the call today, are we having any challenges in that particular area, kind of handling that division between operations and governance? Is it getting murky for you anywhere? Anything anyone would like to share? I'm okay with an awkward silence, so I'll just give it another second. Anyone having struggles with governance versus operations at their board? Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to take it as yes, you are, but it's internal and you don't want to share it on this call. That's okay. But know that generally many people are. Many people struggle with this true definition. And it doesn't really matter if you're an all volunteer led organization or you have a staff of 100. There are always times where the board maybe oversteps a little bit into operational things. It could be even thinking about things like, hey, do I know I have that one board member that is calling up my development director every other week to tell them what they think they should be doing? Well, this is just, this is what happens, right? So it's, where does the board need to focus in on what is our lane? And if we have a development director, like yay you, because not every nonprofit does, right? But our development director knows how to do their job around fundraising. So we need to trust and believe that our development director is doing that job. And my role as a board member is to, if I have a million great ideas about fundraising, to bring that to our fund development committee and discuss it so that we can then have our DD develop a plan or strategy for that idea. So think about that. I'm sure there are examples at your organization, and that's just okay because it happens at every nonprofit. So it's just reminding us to stay in our lane, who is doing it when. So really thinking about SMART goals, like as in how are they really specific? How are our agendas set to goal? So really our agendas are helping us to constantly reflect and talk about our actual major strategic goals, as opposed to just having one of those situations where we develop the strategic plan and put it on a shelf. I mean, that again is a part of like a really strong board agenda, is like, how often are we checking in on those key performance indicators and talking about the major goals that we've set out for this year or the next couple of years? So let's talk a little bit more about the actual, individual roles and responsibilities. One of the main things to know is that when we are talking about the board's two-way responsibility, it's of course that collaborative team. How am I governing as part of this group, but also how am I individually supporting the organization? What is my role? What expertise or special skill set am I bringing to the board table to personally contribute? So we can think about that in many different ways. Of course, you're always going to hear the tagline, time, talent, treasure, but thinking more, more big picture as far as, am I the type of person that is a functional board member? As in, I'm a CPA. I know they invited me onto the board because they wanted that level of expertise at their finance committee, and they need someone to really help them, oversee these books. Or am I more of that ambassador type of person? Am I really great at, developing a couple of different elevator pitches and going out there and working my networks? Am I good at connecting our staff or other board members to other potential partners and donors? Am I someone that is more of a thanker? Like maybe I don't have the skill set or the network to have a million people at my beck in, but I can be really good at stewarding. And as far as I'm going to go and call that person, write them a handwritten note, follow up with them to where they feel really cared for and valued by the organization. So what is that role that I have to play? There's got to be something. Like there's a reason you join the board aside from just your passion, but a reason that you have this conversation with your CEO or your board chair around why I would be a good addition and what skill set do I bring. So here on the left, we have our basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards. You're going to see this, and every single time you Google board responsibilities, this is them on the left. Hopefully this is a part of like an onboarding packet, whether it's in just general expectations as far as your board role. But this is something to think about. And another way that you can do like a board evaluation is actually evaluating the board as it pertains to each of these individual responsibilities. And then the role of the CEO on the other side, how does that tie in? So looking at board roles as far as ensuring effective planning, ensuring adequate financial resources, building a competent board. I always stop on that one because a lot of times, people assume that the CEO is the one that is responsible for board recruitment at the end of the day. Well, that's actually not true. That's one of the basic responsibilities of nonprofit board members. So constantly thinking about, once I've come onto the board, the time that I know I'm going to roll off that year ahead, thinking about and strategically, evaluating who could be the person to replace me. Because what we never want to have at the board is a shortage of passionate, expert board members. So, that's one of our primary roles. And of course, our CEO is out there, building the relationships and is always kind of that primary visual representative of the organization. But our board members should also be out there, connecting, strategizing. For those of you that serve in corporate roles, it can be a little bit easier, right? It's easy to say, like, hey, I work for Wells Fargo, or I work at, Florida Blue. And when I roll off, I'm going to tap a colleague that I think would be a good replacement for me. But for those of us that aren't in that corporate world, it's really who is in my network. If you haven't done one of those network maps recently, where you draw the bubbles of like, who do I go to church with? Who is in my like alumni pool? Who am I, seeing at this extracurricular activity all the time that I do? This is where we start to kind of get a visual map in our heads of who are people that are close to me that I could also use for potential, fundraising resources. So again, I'm going to just pause here briefly and see, as for all of you on today, what would you visualize as being the most difficult responsibility to execute as a board member? And I'll go back to this list if you want to look at it. Oh, maybe I will. It doesn't want to go back. No. There we go. So which of these is the most difficult board responsibilities to execute? Got a quiet group today. All right, well, I'm going to answer for you then. I know that what everybody always says, the number one is fundraising. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why everybody finds that to be so scary. But what we know, first of all, thinking about ourselves as an individual, our financial contribution, we are, as board members, expected to donate to the best of our ability. Now, we can talk a lot about, the ethics around that, especially now in the last couple of years as diversity, equity, and inclusion have really risen to the top of like major discussions happening among nonprofit organizations, leadership, and funders. Is this still a relevant best practice? That's a great question. If you are sitting at your board table talking a lot about diversity and inclusion, and you think you have a standard give and get policy that is maybe hampering diversifying your board, maybe it's time to have a discussion about that at the board table. A lot of people that are really serious about increasing the diversity of their boards might shift from a traditional give and get policy to something that is more along those, are the top giving priority. So making a gift that's, personal to you, but also meaningful, as in giving to your top three priorities to the organization. Or some are even talking about dismantling policies like that altogether and being more inclusive of mission, experience, and knowledge. So say you realize a gap you have in your board diversity pool is that you don't have someone that represents your constituent base, someone that's received services. Oftentimes that can be hard if we're talking about organizations that serve homeless youth, domestically abused women and children, animals, right? So how can we think about, if we know that our service population is likely not able to be the person that is a major funder and thus a board member, could we alter our board policies to include in our demographic matrix of folks that we're looking for someone that has true mission knowledge, that has that tie to the work that we've been doing, because that is invaluable. You could hear directly from that person around how they experienced your programs and services and what their feedback is and ideas they have to make it better and stronger. So, there's a lot to think about here. Most folks, I would say, do have some kind of policy that is centered around 100% board giving. And the reason that is because that's what a lot of funders are asking for. So this is still a conversation that's being had, part of the advocacy work we do at the nonprofit centers, to think about these kinds of bigger ethical conversations and to advocate for changes if need be. But if funders are saying, hey, does 100% of your board give to your organization, and they want to hear yes, it's because they want to know, why would I give to your organization if your own board members do not? So having that kind of conversation at the board can be really helpful and eye-opening. But what else can the board do? I mean, the primary role of the board is to ensure the organization has adequate funding to fulfill its mission. At the end of the day, that's the primary role. So how can I do something that is, again, personally meaningful? Can I write a handwritten thank you note? A lot of times people don't expect the mail anymore, right? So it's nice to get that as opposed to an automatically generated email from a database. Could I host an event that I invite my friends to? But then simpler things. Sometimes we're like, hey, I don't have the ability to host a major event at my house or something, but could I do something as simple as really know the programs and impact and the giving menu of my organization, so that when I am out there just talking to general community members about the work that we do, and someone says they're interested and how can I get involved, or how could I donate, or how could I volunteer, that your next answer is, I don't know, let me follow up. But to have an answer, to have some way to push them in the direction towards taking action that moment, that day, right? And then even things like inviting your CEO or development staff to attend a function on your behalf. So say you are the one that goes to a lot of events in the community and you're invited to things all the time. Well, have you thought about just asking someone from the board that you serve on to come with you, so they can also get that exposure? And if it's a development staff, you don't have to do the asking. They're the ones that are going to show up and work that room, but it's just about getting the access, right? So what networks do you have access to? And, at the end of the day, a lot of times fundraisers, CEOs, they tend to feel a little bit short shrifted by board members when it comes to that role of engaging in resource allocation and generation. But it's one of the major roles that we do have to play. And we have to think about it as, we are not beggars. We're not starving. We're not asking someone to fill our cup. We are asking to align what we need with what goals they have as far as improving the community. We saw the public perception poll earlier. We know that many folks in our community think that more folks should be engaged with donating and volunteering. So how can we turn their passion for service and their altruism into a gift on behalf of your organization? So we know that CEOs tend to feel that that's the largest gap in satisfaction, is the board's role in fundraising, but we have to invest the resources in it. And it's not just one person's job. It's also not just the board's job. The CEO, of course, has a major role to play there, and really the whole organization. Many cultures, I'm sure if you're familiar with organizations like the YMCA, it is very clear and evident and upfront to every single staff member, whether they are working the front desk or, training on the training floor, the gym floor, that they are expected and asked to give and participate in the organization in some way. So that's one of the hard ones. When we think a lot about other major kind of like deeper dives into board roles and responsibilities, so we've covered like that fiduciary side, the strategy. A lot of times what we're seeing more of, this lingo, is around generative. And what does that really mean? Is generative thinking is around, just being willing to generate a large quantity of ideas, kind of throwing a lot at the table. Sometimes we tend to, as a board culture, if we've been around long enough, it's easy for us to say, we tried that before. We did that 5 years ago. It didn't work. And to kind of to kill an idea before it's even really brainstormed or thought out. So how can we be more willing to generate a large quantity of ideas, to generate a variety outside of our typical, kind of think of it almost as like zero-based budgeting or planning, where you're kind of going back to ground zero and saying like, let's really reflect on this. And does this program really still service our needs? Is it really still hitting our mission? Is it really still bringing in new folks to our organization? And then, detail, what's our solution here? How are we going to come together to strategize what's next if we know we need to scrap program ABC? So how can we do that? New governance thinking has us really think about, scanning our environment, kind of doing like a SWOT analysis. So those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and re-examining our goals. How do we reframe tough challenges and think about, what does this mean if we just kind of were to start all anew again? A lot of people had this kind of eye-opening experience during the pandemic when it's like, say we just completed our budget for the new fiscal year and, March 2020, here we go, everything is completely shut down. We had to cancel all our major fundraising events, any program that we had in person, and completely shift our thinking around how did we offer services to the community. So how did we do that? And, thinking about the lessons that we learned there, I hope so many of those like board meeting notes and minutes were really well written and captured, because chances are your board of the future is going to need that kind of reflective moment to say, like, what if a hurricane comes and knocks down our building? What if another pandemic happens? What if? We always need to be ready as a board to think about the totally unexpected and to pivot on a moment's notice and to bring up that budget plan CDE. So how can we be really like adaptive as a board overall? And when we know that it's like really, when it comes down to it, it oftentimes really just comes down to diversity of thought and background among our board members, so that we are able to think more strategically and have more of those kind of productive conflict discussions where it's like, yeah, we thought this sounded good, but now we need to just, think of something totally new. Think about the future. How do we connect to our community? How do we get really true, honest, transparent feedback? And then start to, basically say, hey, we're no longer content with the status quo. We want to be more proactive. We want to have cutting edge. Like, what would that mean? Like all the discussions recently around, for example, AI. So AI and ChatGPT and how all of this new tech is affecting major corporations. Well, guess what? That is coming down the line to nonprofits as well. So, it's nonprofits are always a little bit behind the curve. Like all of our big corporations are going to get access to this kind of stuff first. But in the next couple of years, nonprofits are also going to have to deal with questions like, what if we were to fire half of our staff and we had, some AI program that was able to do intake of our clients and services? That's a real question. Like, it's an ethical question. It's a business question. It's our fund development question. So these are really just, how can we make sure our board is cultivating, again, a board of inquiry, a board that is diverse and brings many different perspectives to the table. What we know, again, from BoardSource, boards are disconnected from the communities and people they serve. So when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity is no longer a nice to have. For many, many years, it's unfortunately been that way, but it's not working anymore. Like, the community sees what's happening. They look at your organization, they see the all-white board, they see that you're then serving a neighborhood of BIPOC individuals, and they say, what's going on? Like, are you hearing from this community? Do you have someone in leadership that can speak to our needs and what's really going on? So we need to think about it. And it's not just race and ethnicity. Of course, that's a big one, but it's also, it's gender, it's sex, it's, even zip codes. Like, if our organization, we serve Northeast Florida, is everyone on our board from Duval County? No. It has to be thinking about things like, are we hearing from folks in Clay, Nassau, Baker? We always institute a rule on our board that we have someone that works in the nonprofit sector. So it's not just hearing from our board members who are all lawyers and CPAs, but then hearing from a board member that is involved, deeply ingrained in the nonprofit sector and what they see as far as what the Nonprofit Center is doing for nonprofits. So what does the demographic, like, what does diversity really look like for your organization? It's up to you to have that kind of discussion and understanding of your business model and how your programs and services operate. So just another quick research piece to highlight for you all from the Nonprofit Center is that we just completed earlier this year our 2023 compensation and benefits report. We do this every couple of years for those that aren't familiar, but what we do is we survey the sector on comp and ben practices. And so a couple of things we know related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course, is that the leadership is still overwhelmingly white. We've really not moved the bar very far in the past couple of years since we last did this report, or in perpetuity. Sector staff are primarily female. However, leadership is still more male dominated. So what does that mean for as far as, the equity across the board, as far as things like pay structures, PTO, maternity leave, things like that? You'd be surprised the number of girls serving organizations that don't have maternity leave policies in place. Really, really unfortunate. And that the average CEO is 55 years old and has been in their role for almost 8 years. So if you're expecting transition, what does that mean? Do you at the board, do you have a succession plan in place? Do you have both a standard succession plan and an emergent one? So like our CEO loves to say, Rena says, what if I were to get hit by a car today when I walk out of the office? What are you guys going to do? So you have to have an emergency plan in place too, because chances are these things happen, they just do. So definitely check out that research. I will just say for anybody that's interested, since it is brand new for this year, this report actually details, there's I think it's something like 30 to 40 different job roles and titles, and the overall, standard compensation and benefits practices for things like CEOs, development directors, program directors, administrative personnel, teachers, licensed therapists. So, if you're using a lot of staff, that can be a really helpful report. So just one more touch on Leap of Reason, because it's another just a great resource that I will shout out to eternity. But these are just, how is the board thinking about their approach to board roles? Are we humble and seeking to act on feedback? So again, another kind of poll for doing a board evaluation. Sometimes you might be sitting there like, gosh, I really don't want to hear it. I don't want to know what the whole board thinks about our processes. But hey, hearing that honest data can be a really great starting point for changing things up a little bit, or adjusting our processes or our bylaws as need be. How are we cultivating DEI at every level? Do we really think about external communication as a strategic function? So, thinking about how are we, relaying the messages of our mission work out to the community. So just some great things to think about. I'm not going to delve too deeply into that, but just check this out. I always send out in our resources links to BoardSource, Leading with Intent, Leap of Reason, great resources for thinking about this work deeper. A few quick findings from Leading with Intent, though. Only 20% of CEOs feel their board members are prepared to a great extent for meetings. So simple job right there is when your CEO, now it is on them, of course, too. They should not be sending out the full board packet for your board meeting tonight at 8 a.m. today. Chances are you have a life and a job, and you don't have time to deeply review those materials prior to the board meeting. So, if the CEO though is sending those out a week ahead of time or a few days prior to the meeting, doing our best job to really prepare, read through the materials, understand what we're about to vote on in our consent agenda during the board meeting. And then, assessing our performance. So only about 40% of boards have done a self-assessment in the last 3 years. So thinking about that statistic, where are we in that pool as well? We could assess the individual board member. So send out like a survey monkey and have individual board members talk about how are they performing to what they think are their board roles and responsibilities. You could assess board meetings. So are you feeling like your agendas are a little stagnant and you're not getting a lot of deep conversation and discussion at the board table? It feels like too much reporting. Maybe we assess our board meetings. Do we assess the work as a group? How are we as a board really performing to goal as we set forth in our strategic plan? And then also don't forget to evaluate the CEO. Again, you'd be shocked about the number of CEOs that have been in their roles for years and say, I don't think I've had an evaluation in 3 years. So, you set out these goals, your strategic plan. What piece of that, what is your CEO doing to those goals? What are their key performance indicators? And have you actually, given them a review recently to say like, hey, you're really, missing the mark here, or we need to talk about, like, sometimes it's just honestly, the support and advice the CEO, that's a core responsibility. So maybe your CEO doesn't have all of the development connections. Maybe they need some help getting access to funders and things. So really reviewing those goals. And then again, from research, we know that stronger understanding of programs is linked to stronger engagement and also fundraising. So right there again, if you are an organization that has 5, 6, 7, 8 programs, are you out there giving the same elevator pitch again and again? Or could you maybe tailor that pitch to your audience and know like, hey, program A is really going to align with the heartstrings of this group I'm talking to, but program B I know is going to really hit these folks. And also knowing how to talk to people, like, are they the heartstrings people, or are they the people that are obsessed with the data and the metrics and they want to hear some statistics from you? So if you're going to start talking about a program, have some basic knowledge there, because someone could easily say, oh yeah, well, how many people did you serve with that program last year? And you're like, I don't know, 10? And it's like, no, it was actually 100. Don't, shortchange yourself there. So how knowledgeable are we really about the programs? And just a couple of quick things on really just thinking about the meeting side of things again, whether virtual or not, a lot of folks are still doing kind of hybrid meetings since the pandemic. Is just, thinking about that too, really clearly, because we found at the Nonprofit Center, we try to mix it up. We'll do like an every other is virtual or in person, but the virtual ones tend to be a little quieter than the in-person ones, right? So we see it right now. Like folks are a little more easy to press mute and sit back on a virtual setting than they are in person. So maybe you've held over virtual meetings since the pandemic and you've never pushed to go back in person. Maybe it's time. Sometimes that's really great for access, but it can be limiting for true, robust discussion. So how are meetings working for you right now? And again, do you have like a really clear, focused agenda? Making sure meetings start and end on time. People, they want their time respected. One thing that one of our consultants from BoardSource actually shared with us, once, is that if you think about a board meeting, think about it as the most expensive meeting your nonprofit will ever have, because that group of individuals with all of their backgrounds and expertise at the table, that hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it is that you're spending with them, that is a hugely expensive, valuable meeting. And do you want to be just reporting at these people who have all of this knowledge and expertise, or do you want them actively engaged in discussing major issues, major, financial variances and strategies for how to handle problems? So how are we really effectively using meeting time? And of course, things to think about in meetings, engagement at every single meeting, have like mission at the forefront. So reminding them, why are we here? Why do we do this work? And then also the governance side. So what discussion items do we have? How are we thinking about board recruitment? What education or learning component might be needed? Are we about to embark on a huge capital campaign and we have not, ever trained our board members in what it means to have a capital campaign? Like that is a big, big task. So, what are the major things that we need to engage folks during a board meeting? Just a couple of things to think about there. And of course, as I shared a little bit earlier, our effective committees, that's where board work is being done. Pretty much every single board member should be tasked with being on a board committee at some point, and that should be an expectation. I think oftentimes we hear from nonprofits like, yeah, we're trying to get this committee going, but no one wants to step up. Like we ask, like we're like, hey, we've developed this committee, and it's like crickets at the board. Well, that's unfortunate when it's like a brand new committee and, the culture is kind of not to engage. But as you're doing your board recruitment, saying like, hey, we're going to bring you onto the board. I'm really interested in you serving on the fund development committee. I'm really interested in you participating in our finance committee. Does that sound good to you? Okay, let's join the board. So how can we engage board members from day one in the expectation that they need to be involved in committee work in some way? And then thinking about how committees are there to facilitate work happening and are not to do all the work on their own in a silo. Like just because there's a fund development committee doesn't mean those 3 people are the sole fundraisers for the board. No, they're developing that strategy and then they're bringing it to the larger board table call and saying, hey, so here's what we've talked about. Now we need your help to connect the dots here with funders, foundations, etc. So how do we structure committees? Of course, it's per your bylaws. Bylaws can be changed. If your bylaws are too stringent or not, really true to what your current kind of board committee structure looks like, that's part of the governance committee's work, is to update and review the bylaws. Is this governance work or is this committee work? A typical, governance committees are, of course, the finance, governance, and development, as I said earlier, but maybe you have some operational committees specific to events, programs, facilities, and maybe is this, long-term work, or again, is this a one-time issue such as strategic planning or like a special task force on the budget if we know we have some major new grant coming in that is a defined period of 2-3 years, and we want to understand how to use this grant the right way and how to budget for it. And then selecting leadership. So, if our chair is responsible for kind of arranging how committees and meetings look, helping them to see the leadership vision to the succession planning of the board itself. Like when we're doing board recruitment, we also want to keep in mind, like, who is going to lead that fund development committee and who is going to lead our finance committee? Like we need some folks that are in the know that can really be the guide for that group of board members. So another quick poll I'm going to just ask you all is, what practices are you currently using to develop your board members' competencies? So there's a couple of options on there. Feel free to scroll, and it's multiple choice. Just kind of want to see what you all are doing at your organizations. Okay, I got a couple. I'm gonna give it another minute and just see if we get any more flooding in. And I know if you're on a phone, it's like harder to see, so don't worry about that. All right, I would say we got the majority, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share it out to the group as well. Oh, let me end it. There we go. All right, so it looks like, of course, periodic trainings on board roles. Yay, check for today. You all have done it. And then, trainings on other relevant topics such as development finance. Looks like more of you are doing mission moments, which is great. Like I highly recommend that. The board loves to hear from, either program participants or staff members and how they're engaged in the work. A board mentorship program, only one person says they're doing that, but that can also be really helpful if you are bringing on, maybe, soon you're going to be doing like a big recruitment of like a couple of new board members at once. You might want to pair them with like a board buddy who's experienced and can kind of give the lowdown on the operations and of the board and how your culture looks. So just, a couple of ideas there for you to take back if there's not something you're really focused on right now. And, really, we're going to kind of end here on don't forget about advocacy, because that also is the prime responsibility of a board member. You are seen as a true board ambassador, right? Like you are out there walking the walk, talking the talk. Board members are also reflected on in the community. So like, being careful of how we are presenting ourselves when we show up to events and things, how we're speaking on behalf of the organization. Say you do have an issue with your new CEO that you just hired, it's not something that you want to go out and start spreading around town, because that, and at the end of the day, will just reflect badly on the organization as a whole. So, if we have our nits and picks and our issues among the board, we don't really want to go around bad mouthing it to the rest of the community, because you're going to roll off that board one day and we don't want to hurt the entire organization. So what is my elevator pitch, but then also how can I also support like collaborations that I know our nonprofit has. So same thing that you would do with like knowing your important donors and staff members, like knowing their names, knowing their faces. If you're at an event and your nonprofit has a major community partner with like another nonprofit or, a corporate partner, like it wouldn't hurt to be aware of who those people are so that you could also go up and shake their hand, thank them when you're out and about. But really participating in that development cycle, advocacy and fundraising are so tied together because it's the advocacy work. It's how your organization is seen in the public eye that trickles down to how dollars are brought in the door, right? So how are we participating as far as like, if you have a mission that is very tied to public policy, something around maybe affordable housing or homelessness or, hunger, whatever that is, you then really do need to be in the know around, the news and the politics around that particular issue, because, chances are you should be showing up at, public meetings on said new affordable housing projects and speaking about your case and sharing about the mission of your organization and why it's so needed, because nonprofits are experts at their community's social ill, right? So if we are experts on this problem, then we need to be telling the rest of the community that could help us with that problem what we know and why we're experts. And when board members show up, that's just so much more powerful than just a paid staff person. So another great quote from Stand for Your Mission: the voice of the unpaid volunteer board member speaking out of altruism or passion, it could potentially be much more influential than the highest paid lobbyist. So, lobbyists paid, that's their job. That's what they're paid to do, is to go out there and fight for issues. But when board members who have these great, networks of just your own community that you're involved with, if you're out there speaking about these issues, it can be really, really impactful. Your words spread to so many other people that and then they're sharing it out as well. So how are we thinking about and speaking about our work? So we're wrapping up. I'm going to go ahead and have Jamera go ahead and put into the chat a link to a survey for today, because we love to hear your feedback as well. What was good for you? What did you need more of? But just pausing for another second to see if there's anything that kind of surprised you today or top of your priorities list. Okay, while you're thinking about it, maybe. There we go. Some other resources for boards. We do have a board bank at the Nonprofit Center. So if you're actively recruiting, looking for board members, you can post your board openings to the board bank. It's not just full-term board members, but also committees. If you're looking for committee members, we do have a quarterly board newsletter we send out on everything board resources, and just, of course, a ton of other like BoardSource, National Council of Nonprofits, other great resources for board services and support. And then last but not least, just a reminder of some events and things we have coming up. Our next quarterly board rolls will be in November. So if you have other board colleagues or, other organizations you serve with, let them know. We'd love to have them. And, last but not least, my name and my email. I will email you all with a follow-up with the presentation, probably not until tomorrow morning, but you'll get an email with the follow-up recording. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.